only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am. So if you were listening to the concept and then a contemplation were to happen, which is sort of the natural movement of the intellect when it's just working, which the intellect has sort of two sides, the thinking mind and the working mind. The thinking mind is the intellect working in a sort of misguided way where it's essentially working off a sense of who we are that is a little misguided. That's the thinking mind, and that sort of causes all sorts of problems and feelings about life that can fall away. So it's good that it's misguided because it creates a whole lot of feelings which are, and when those misguided ideas fall away, we find that the uncomfortableness falls away. The working mind, on the other hand, is a part of our intellect that is doesn't include this false sense of self, this false identity, and it's just functional thinking. And so as we consider a problem, as we start getting more information about a dynamic in life, and we find some thoughts arising about it, and maybe some questions, and then maybe some answers to those questions, the whole topic tends to flesh itself out. And as it fleshes itself out, we essentially have a better grasp of it than we did before. And that can happen, what might seem like, oh, that is my thinking and I'm directing it. But from another point of view, you look back and you think, wow, over the last month, each day there was a little bit of thinking about consciousness or about awareness or about teachings being concepts and not the truth. And as that thinking happened, our understanding developed, and we look back on it in hindsight and we see, oh, well, there wasn't much of an understanding, and a month later I now have a better understanding. And we might see that a lot of it, or all of it, wasn't really in my control, even though it felt like I am thinking, is that it was a follow-on from what was understood the day before. And really, we can say it was a result of factors that I'm not really in control of. Like, for example, how some information is processed, what answer comes up to a certain question. And we get the right answer, we may get the wrong answer. If we get the wrong answer but think it's the right answer, then everything else follows on, will include that error. And so we can come to the conclusion is that, wow, the whole thing unfolded because of a whole lot of thinking that really just happened. So if we were going to hear that concept, anything that is written or spoken about as a concept, it is not the truth. The only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am. We might sort of say, okay, this is interesting. It says it's not the truth. It also says it's not to be thrown out just because it's not the truth, because don't throw a concept out just because it is relative and limited and not the thing itself, because it's still valuable. But it has specified it's not the truth. The only truth in the manifestation, and it's interesting that it specifies in the manifestation, which refers to really daily living. That's what the manifestation, in the context I'm using it in at the moment, basically refers when there is experience, when there are objects and the awareness of those objects present. So in deep sleep, when the experience of the world collapses, then we would say that is the absence of the manifestation. So the only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am. Now, why is it that it says in the manifestation? Why does it specify? Because the impersonal sense of I am falls away when the experience of life falls away, when all objects and awareness of the objects and awareness of itself collapse, then this impersonal sense of I am also collapses. And so something can't be truth if it comes and goes. However, in the manifestation, within daily living, the impersonal sense of I am is the basis of the daily living experience, the manifestation. Now, that impersonal sense of I am often is covered up, and there is a much more personal sense, like I am this or that. But if we really get to the bottom of it, we find that that personal sense of I exist as such and such is really stemming from the fact that there is a very impersonal, and impersonal basically means a sense of self that isn't pervaded with human or personal characteristics. It doesn't have an age, it doesn't have a sex, it doesn't have preferences, it doesn't think, it just is. And there is the capacity for us to rest as that when a whole lot of the other faculties that color or that add layers on top of that impersonal sense of I am fall away. So when thinking about the past and the future, and not only the past and future in terms of suffering, but even the thought of just remembering the past without it being suffering, that tends to create, I remember the past relative to being a person living in the past. And so it creates this personal sense. And when those faculties fall away, not necessarily permanently, but you could say in meditation, just quietly, it could be that certain thinking that for a while is very habitual starts to subside. And why does it subside? It subsides because we receive pointers, hints from teachings that suggest that if you want to know the core of who you are, if you want to know what could be referred to as the truth of who you are or your essence, really one needs to drop beneath the layer of thinking, at least to start to get established in that essence. And then once there's an establishment in that essence, then certain faculties of thought, of specific thoughts, can come back and not disturb a sense of that essence. But until that establishment happens, it's very important for a whole lot of thinking, even thinking that isn't suffering, to subside. And teachings understand this. So they give us these hints. They give us these pointers. Say what you truly are, your true nature, is impersonal, isn't colored with all of these personal characteristics, and it's ever present and unchanging. And I add in the manifestation. Now, someone might say, well, if that's the truth in the manifestation, but it's not an ultimate truth, then shouldn't I be looking for an ultimate truth? And that logic makes sense until we add in a very important factor. And the important factor, or the important consideration, is what am I really looking for? Am I looking for the ultimate truth, as in, am I looking to know the ultimate truth of the universe or whatever? Or am I really looking for something different from that? Now, if we come up with the solution that I'm looking for the ultimate truth, and we're correct, then you do need to know something beyond the truth in the manifestation. However, if we conclude what I'm really looking for, and we can conclude this if we say, I need to keep the seeking practical. It's no point seeking something that doesn't solve the problem. And when we look at what the problem is in practical terms, we find really the only reason I'm seeking is because there's an uncomfortableness with life. And so what is it that the seeking is about in practical terms? And we might have found that the seeking starts off being about truth. We might think it's about truth. And at some point we realize, is it about truth? Because when I look at the problem on a practical level, I find that actually my seeking was inspired by and driven by an uncomfortableness in life. So what I'm really seeking, if I'm honest and keep it practical, is the of uncomfortableness, the end of suffering. And the end of suffering, which is the end of something very practical, it's a feeling of uncomfortableness, can be called peace of mind. So the absence, the falling away, the end of suffering, the word that we use in this teaching for the end of suffering is peace of mind. And so by default, what is peace of mind? Is peace of mind a pleasurable feeling? Is it a peaceful feeling? No, it is a very ordinary state that is not even something we can describe in a positive sense, because it doesn't have positive characteristics. As in, it isn't the addition of a feeling of peace. What it is the removal of a feeling of disturbance, of uncomfortableness. So it's almost like when we say there is peacetime as opposed to wartime. What is peacetime? Peacetime is just the absence of wartime. It isn't the addition of something that makes it peacetime. It is the subtraction of war. And similarly, our peace of mind is not the addition of a positive feeling or a positive something, but the absence of internal conflict, internal suffering. And if we agree that what I'm looking for in practical terms is peace of mind for the human being in daily living, and we look at it and I say, well, we say, actually in deep sleep, I'm not looking for peace of mind because there's no suffering. There's already no suffering in deep sleep. So is that driving my seeking? No, my seeking is being driven by the uncomfortableness in daily living. So what I'm looking for is peace of mind in daily living. Maybe we are intuitively, we know that we are seeking, we begin to seek peace of mind because in deep sleep, there is no suffering. And so the very fact that the end of suffering is known on some level may well plant the seed that tells us, really, this uncomfortable feeling is the problem. And so if it becomes clear, yes, actually, I could easily get confused thinking that what I'm looking for is bliss or oneness or truth or special powers or heaven on earth. All sorts, actually, if you go into different teaching paths, and for good reason, because seekers are all at different levels, and therefore to keep a seeker interested when they are a certain type of seeker, you might actually have to say it's about something else, which is sort of like a bit of a trick, but it's a cunning trick which is in the best interest of the seeker. Because if you told them it was about them getting nothing, them losing something, and maybe you say, to make it more, not to make it more appealing, but how you could describe it is you're losing something uncomfortable. Most seekers are so convinced, not only seekers, but most people in life are so convinced that happiness will come by them getting lots of great things. And so being told you're going to lose, not get, but don't worry, you're going to lose something not so pleasant, is nowhere near enough incentive to dedicate the amount of energy and time that will keep us immersed in a field of information that over time will change us sufficiently. And so we get told it's about ecstasy or bliss or special powers or union with God or oneness, the end of separation. All of these things are very appealing to the part of us that is looking for something. And then inevitably there are these parts of the process where there are a lot of physical changes that take place, energetic shifts, feelings of emotions, some of them very positive and very pleasant, states of oneness that are very profound. And so when those things happen, which are positive things, which are things that can be experientially felt, then and registered as the presence of something, then we tend to assume, this must be it, because it's been spoken about, and now the glimpses and the experience of it are coming in. So when those events happen, it can reinforce the idea that that's what the seeking is about. So if we, at some point, start to realize, wow, this attachment to outcome could well be a principle that is morphing and attaching to new special outcomes that we are starting to get a taste of, and that may be the same error, just transposed into a different dimension of experience or a different area of life. So we might have been attached to outcomes on the financial level, or outcomes in terms of interhuman relationships, material outcomes, lifestyle, all sorts of outcomes we might have been convinced were our happiness was going to be. That didn't deliver. We then realize, it must be somewhere else. We hear about spiritual seeking. Some people decide that meaning will come from becoming a humanitarian and dedicating their life to helping others. And so they just shift the outcome from material to humanitarian outcomes, thinking that's where satisfaction will come. We, as seekers, we might shift it to spiritual goals. And a lot of the spiritual goals that we set up as expectations tend to be states and experiences that we start to get tastes of and that are described in the teachings. So if it clicks, is that what's happened? has my addiction for outcomes, my attachment to outcomes, which really attachment to outcomes means a deeply ingrained, unquestioned assumption, unseen that this is the case, deeply ingrained assumption, belief that what will fix life is outcomes turning out a certain way. So we can live a large part of our life convinced that when something happens, everything will be okay. And what tends to happen is we get there sometimes, we receive what we think will give us happiness. And when we don't have it, we imagine when that happens, then I will be able to relax for the rest of my life. That's when I can stop because life will be okay. And inevitably we get there. We start off at the age, when we've just finished school or university and we get a job, and we start off on a low salary. And let's pick a number, $20,000 a year or $30,000 a year. And then we think, one day when I'm on $50,000 a year, everything will be okay. And you gradually get your pay increases, and you might go up to $70,000 or $80,000 a year, and you're still, one day when I get to $100,000 a year, everything will be okay. And we don't realize that this thought started off, when I get to 30,000, everything will be okay. And we get there, and it clearly isn't the answer. And our expectation, our attachment just moves the goal further forward. And this is the case with romantic love. We're convinced that if we don't have a partner, we're convinced when I get a partner, when I have someone to watch a movie with, everything will be okay. And my suggestion, that's not where our happiness is to be found. And the sooner that we realize that we've spent our whole life attached to outcomes, believing, thinking deeply that that's where contentment and fulfillment is going to come, when it clicks, what if that's wrong? What if that's not where it's to be found? And then we might realize I've had enough experience, enough getting sometimes what I thought would give me unbroken happiness, to realize that it isn't to be found there. But that's only meaningful, the amount of experience getting the things we thought we want and it not delivering is only meaningful once we really become aware of this fact, because usually we get the things, it's not satisfying, and we automatically transpose that thing, that objective, that outcome for the next one, thinking, that must be it. And as an epiphany one day, as an insight, and it's not an insight that comes out of nowhere, really, when you think about it. It's, it could be because you've heard a talk like this, and at the time when the talk is given, it might not hit as an insight. But you might find yourself thinking about the topic and thinking, could it be that happiness isn't to be found in outcomes? And then a piece of the puzzle within your thinking can just click and go, what if I really believe it's to be found there? And so the teaching is saying we have a deeply ingrained belief that my happiness is to be found in outcome. And it's not even seen sometimes to be a deeply ingrained belief. And it might just take us to realize, wow, my whole life I've been seeking this and that. And you might realize, what is it that I'm seeking right in this moment? And I'm not necessarily talking about spiritual seeking, just in terms of circumstance. What is it that you're seeking right now that you're convinced on an unconscious maybe level, where you put the concept onto what you're seeking, You haven't put the concept that says, this is where I'll find my happiness. And yet, if you look, you might realize, wow, I'm waiting for my twin soul or my soulmate to turn up, convinced that's where my happiness is going to be. Or I'm convinced that it's financial independence that will deliver happiness. And so when these things click, which really means when we see it, that can be a moment of significant change, because something that was unseen becomes seen. That doesn't mean we won't fall into the same habit. Something can be seen, like, wow, I have an attachment to finding my soulmate, could be what's seen. And in that moment, it's like, wow, of course, happiness isn't to be found there. And then that understanding can sort of fade away, where it seems to be unknown. It's like we then might find ourselves going back into craving for the soulmate. However, the fact it's been seen has done something in the system. It has added in some credits towards that particular misunderstanding. And, we hear that what has been seen can't be unseen. So what I'm just describing is in support of that, but not in total support of it, because I'm saying that experientially there can be a period of unseeing in a way, which is, it's not really unseeing. It seems like it's unseeing because we go back into the old habit, but some significant damage has been done to the belief in that moment of seeing it. And in fact, expect for the unseeing to happen to some extent. It feels like when it's seen, it feels like this is never going to fade away. I see clearly what the problem is. I see clearly that my happiness can never be found in the deliverance of outcome or pleasure. That yes, the outcome or pleasure will deliver pleasure, and it will make life potentially easier on a circumstantial level. But my unhappiness is always on the attitudinal level. And if my attitude doesn't change, then the fact that circumstance has changed is not going to deliver peace of mind, not going to deliver happiness. So that can be seen clearly. And in that seeing, it can seem like it can't possibly go away. And sure enough, a week later, the clarity can collapse, and you find yourself sort of what seems like propelled back to a place that is not even ground zero. It almost feels like we've regressed to a point beyond where we even started sometimes. And that's normal. It's the process. So if someone tells me, there's peace of mind here, and I can't believe that I engaged in life that way, all that suffering for nothing. It was all based on a certain way of interpreting what people say about me. And I just can't imagine life being like that again. And then a week later, bang, you're back into this energy that can't help but feel and see life that way. And that's not a surprise. I expect that to happen. It's just how the deepening of the understanding happens through a process of flip-flopping. So the clarity you can call the flip, and inevitably a flop happens. And the flop happens because the seeing doesn't wipe out all of the misunderstanding. It has done some damage to the misunderstanding. It has extracted some of it or loosened the structure. And in time, the flop will turn into another flip. And in the flip, there is more seeing and more of the structure collapses. And actually, even in the flop doesn't mean that nothing is happening. The flop can very much be a process where the structure is being weakened. It doesn't feel like it. It feels like there's a chance that we'll never get out of it. But that actually could be a processing, a bit like the immune system. The processing of suffering, the undoing of misunderstanding, as I see it, is very much a parallel to the immune system. It's just an immune system of a different sort. And that as our system becomes more capable of dealing with suffering, means as our system becomes more equipped to understand the dynamics, to see the dynamics, to process what is seen, then more of what is in the subconscious starts to come up into the conscious, and it has to be felt. And while it's being felt, it can seem like nothing positive is happening, and yet the suffering immune system, or the immune system designed to deal with the suffering, which is really false ideas, false beliefs, false assumptions about life, is at work. So, when someone says it's all fallen away, I don't see that as a tragedy. It's a bit like, an illness where you come out of the illness and you feel like you're better, but the doctors know, okay, that's the profile of that illness. On day 4, it feels like it's gone, and look out, day 6, we expect you to feel as bad as you felt on day 2. And that happens. And the patient, if they don't understand that that's the profile of the illness, could freak out. Whereas the doctors say, no, this is okay, this is expected, this is not a bad sign. So I started off talking about concepts as pointers, and I was going to mention that the in general will often encourage the thinking to stop, for there to be silence, quiet, and the end of thinking starts to happen, or the slowing down of thinking, the gaps start to happen. One, when we become aware of this stream of thought, when we become aware that thinking is always thinking about what is. So what is life prior to us labeling it, prior to us judging it. It just is what it is. So if you see, I don't know, a spider ripping apart a fly that is caught in its web, or wrapping it up in web, if we can just see it, and we might have a thought, but not a thought that says it should or shouldn't be. So we could see the fly losing its life. And we might, it may be sort of an expression of the dog-eat-dog world of nature, or the dog-eat-dog nature of nature. And yet, if we just, for what it is, then there is a oneness in a sense with it. The oneness is where we are not in resistance to it. And the resistance often is a layer of thinking that if we're in resistance to it, if we're not able to just allow it to be as it is, then the alignment with what is has been broken. And when we look at it, we find the alignment with what is broken because there is a thought that says, this shouldn't be. And if that starts up and we see that it's a thought that creates separation, then we might be able to find ourselves dropping back into a place prior to the thinking. We might find ourselves going into a story about the cruelty of life, and we might just realize that stop the story. And if the story falls away, the actual unfolding of life still carries on. The fly still loses its life, or it might have one last struggle and it pulls away from the web, and the spider's there going, damn it, lost him. So when our thinking falls away, we realize it still carries on. Whatever is carries on. And so we might start to realize, wow, there's this quiet place outside of my thinking about what is. And we might realize that the thinking about what is, which sort of condenses what is into my view of what is, and then we throw in my view, which includes whether it should or shouldn't be, whether it's fair or it's not fair, all of that. And it becomes a whole layer of concept. If we see that, and the concept of thinking, which are in themselves concepts fall away, that's where we might find the impersonal sense of I am. Because the impersonal sense of I am is not to be found on the level of thinking. And when the level of thinking is present, when it's active, it tends to take center stage. And the more subtle components of life tend to slide into the background. They're still there. They just get covered up, we could say. The other noisier components take center stage. When we find a process where the noisier components are getting interfered with, getting turned off, it's like there's a mute button starts to have presented itself. And the mute button comes when we realize there's life, and life plus my commentary about it. And when the commentary starts to fall away, we start to realize it's an extra. And it's not really an extra that delivers much benefit. In fact, it's an extra where this layer of identity resides. And that identity is often an uncomfortable identity with life, or an identity that feels very uncomfortable with life. And when the identity feels uncomfortable with life, that's what we feel we are, the uncomfortable identity, and that means life is uncomfortable. And that's what drives the seeking, because not an uncomfortableness of the hot sun, that would be a physical uncomfortable. It's an uncomfortableness on the level of who we know ourselves as. The impersonal sense of I am isn't capable of feeling uncomfortable with itself. That's why there is the encouragement to abide in I am. If we find ourselves abiding in I am, it means we're abiding in our true essence, and our true essence, we will know experientially, is free of suffering. Now, if we hear about this essence that is free of suffering and don't get some of the components of the descriptions, like sense of I am is part of what is, and it's prior to thinking, and that thinking covers it up, then what might happen is if that isn't grasped, if it isn't heard, or if it's heard but it's not really understood, the thinking, which is the faculty of the human being that is most strong and most active, will go off trying to find the impersonal sense of I am, a project that is doomed to failure and frustration. Because the teachings have actually pointed out that I am is known by itself on a layer or level dimension prior to thinking, which really we don't need to go and find the dimension prior to thinking. It's about the thinking coming to a halt. And so you can't do that by trying to think the thinking to a halt. And if this nuance isn't understood, because we're convinced, we're so used to solving and trying to dealing with life through thought, we're convinced that, okay, I have to find this impersonal sense of I am, and I have to think about it, I have to understand. And the teaching is saying, stop. Stop and be. And but that part of the thinking, if the message doesn't get through, if it doesn't just create a sudden realization about how that happens, then it's heard and we go, okay, so how do I stop? Or how do I, and off it goes again. So teachings are often thinking is the problem. And because that's a concept, thinking is the problem. It can be used, it's not the truth, it's accurate from a certain angle. So we do see that the thinking about who I am and what I need obscures the sense of I am that is found when the thinking slows down. And at the same time, maybe in a slightly different context, we have to realize, no, thinking is not the real problem, which also is a concept, because still the previous statement that the sense of I am is obscured by thinking is true, is accurate. And at the same time, if we say, make thinking something we wish we didn't have, then that too can be an over-exaggeration. That too could be something that we don't want to hold as truth. The idea that we said, oh, thinking is the enemy, please take my thinking away, then if God obliged, we'd suddenly realize we wouldn't even realize this. We just wouldn't be able to function without thought. So then we need to refine it down and see, oh, there's a difference. There's the working mind and the thinking mind. It's the thinking mind with all of its judgment and all of its attachment and all of the sense of doership. That is what really disturbs one's peace of mind. But we also have to see that at some points in the process, in order for an establishment in an aspect of the human that has been sort of closed off, in order for that to be established, periods where there is no thinking mind and no working mind are very valuable. And so we can describe both the thinking mind and the working mind as the problem for certain stages of our process. And so that's why we have to be able to hold the concepts as relative and see, wow, there's we can say thinking is the problem, and it can be correct, and at the same time it's not entirely correct. So anyway, the point of this satsangs is be appreciative of the fact that all thinking, slowing down and being put aside for periods of time, an hour, 5 minutes, 2 minutes, can be very beneficial. But let's not think that we will live the rest of our life with no thought. So let's go into some questions. Hello, Carolina.
Hello. Hello. My English is not very good, but I will try to explain me. I understand. Okay. Sorry. I understand your point. How to be, let's see, in the business. And when I am, always you are in the business, but sometimes you do the things as the person or as the, how you say, the doer?
The doer, yes, okay.
Okay, but I don't know, for me, it's easy to be in the door than in the business. And when I see some people, I can perceive this peace from the business. And when I am in the business, I can feel the things very different because I'm not involved in the things. Okay, but I don't know. I don't know how can I be in the business the most of the time, or it is something that is happening step by step, or I don't know what can I do for this, or this is something that happened in the life, or I really try to do these kind of things to be conscious in the business, but I would like more, but I don't want to be in the door. I don't know what can I do.
You see, you said you don't want to be in the doer, so what can I do? It was your last statement. So by asking, what can I do? That is the attitude of doership, right? The attitude of non-doership sees, oh, life unfolds, and it might be destined for there to be isness, and it might be destined for there to be no isness. And the doer says, I want there to be isness all the time. Tell me what I need to do to control life. Tell me what I need to do to get isness, 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 isness. And if And obviously that is the problem, right? That is the resistance to what is, oh, I don't want suffering, I want isness. And when we realize this for ourselves, we see, wow, you see, here I am. It's so deeply ingrained. This attitude of doership is, I don't want to be in the doership. Tell me what to do. And we see it and we catch it out. And okay, now I've seen another layer of the attitude. And the alternate attitude, the attitude of non-doership, says, my life is destiny. My life will unfold according to destiny. The amount of pleasure and pain I will receive in life is destined. The amount of isness and involvement that there is in my life is destined. So the doer that wants life to be isness, when that can fall away with the attitude that it will be what it will be. And we might, the doership might hear this and say, this is really bad news because he hasn't told me what to do to get what I want. But actually, this understanding is the falling away of involvement, because the attitude now says, who cares? Or what to do, if there's suffering, there's suffering. And that is actually the attitude of non-doership, which is the attitude of isness. So see if that leads somewhere.
That I feel some resistance because
not persistence by the doer. Sorry, what were you saying?
I say that it's like you smell something, okay, that you can be happy, but in the daily life, the most of the time you are not happy, but you are conscious when you are not happy, but you want to, it's no want, I want to be free, but want is something like the attachment, but I want to be I be in this isness. And if you maybe is the destino. You understand? Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
For me, it's like, I don't know if the destino want this for me or not, but I really want with all my heart. And
go on.
I don't know what can I do to help to the destino to be in this. You are always in this, conscious in this.
Yeah. Because that's the thing is, so if you go around in circles, the problem is suffering is attachment, right? So if you are attached to the end of suffering, that's suffering. So when something clicks in relation to what I've just said, which is destiny, if it happens or not, then it can be significant. Remember, one of the forms of suffering is attachment. Attachment to the end of suffering is attachment, which is more suffering. Wanting to know what to do in order to bring about the end of suffering, you might find is a whole lot of suffering dynamic. So you want with all your heart the end of suffering, and at the same time, what is happening is the suffering in the form of the end of suffering is arising again. So it's like a catch-22. So in English, there is a phrase, catch-22, which really means whatever you do, there isn't a way out. And the catch-22 only comes to an end when it changes, not when you change it. Because that's the nature of catch-22, where there is someone trying to do something, and by default, whatever that person does keeps the cycle in motion. And so the only way that the catch-22, a bit like a hamster on a hamster wheel, the only way that the hamster maybe gets off the hamster wheel is when whatever is keeping the catch-22 in place stops.
Okay.
So there is no doer. That means everything is happening according to God's will. And it's possible that we surrender to God's will. Not the doer doesn't surrender to God's will, but there can be a surrendering. Even simply the realization everything is happening to God's will can be, okay, nothing for me to do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina. Hi, Krishna.
Hey, Roger. Thank you so much for the satsang, as always. Just had a quick question. This question has been coming up lately in the last week. I feel like I've reached the pinnacle of my intellectual understanding in terms of the teaching. I'm kind of letting it seep in, not focus too much on, reading about it a lot more, like trying to practice it in daily life as much as I can. How important or how significant is it, in your opinion, to be with an actual guru or to seek out someone? It's just been something that I've been thinking over the last few weeks, at least. Is it beneficial, or is it enough to, maybe read books or like read discourses or like view videos?
Well, in a way, reading books and discourses is being with a guru. It's different in the sense, maybe you're asking, what about being in the physical presence of a guru, right? And I would categorize being with a guru in the sense of being with the teaching, with a teaching, is very important, in my view. More important than being in the physical presence of the teacher. So just being with the teaching is important. However, being the physical presence, or at least having one-on-one interactions, then brings the teaching to an even stronger potency, you could say, because the teaching then can really be directed to the specifics of the individual. Now, in the past, if someone said, how important is it? Do you need to have a teacher? I would answer that in a way that says, not necessarily, because there is the possibility for life to unfold in strange ways. So Ramana had the mountain as his teacher, and so someone could sort of say, well, that's not really a teacher in the sense that we know. So you could say, well, you don't need a teacher because you can have a mountain. But Ramana referred to that as his teacher. So I wouldn't want it to turn into an expectation for people that I say it's very important to be with a teacher. But objectively, I think it's very important to be with a teacher/teaching, not necessarily in the same space, but immersed in teaching. The hesitation with saying that is that someone will then feel like for the times that they're not, it's a problem. And it's not necessarily like that. There needs to be a surrender to the fact that, well, it might not be destiny for the next 3 months for there to be a teacher or a teacher. And so we don't want to turn that into, this is terrible that there is no teaching or teacher, today. But as an overall objective statement, I would say it is essential to be immersed in a teaching for the very simple, practical fact that what happens is someone has the benefit of all of their experience that they received help with from their teacher and the teachings. So essentially the work is being done for us to a large degree by those on before, and then they give us condensed versions of a whole lot of contemplation and thinking that they've gone through. And that doesn't mean we then don't have to do anything with that, because you can't just be given someone else's understanding. But they are the pointers that say, hey, don't waste your time looking over there and over there. What's really important is to look at this. And without a teaching telling us that, we sort of go off and we're reinventing the wheel, and the internet and all of the inventions that have happened. We basically have to invent them ourselves. And it's not going to happen, right? But when we get all the information in condensed form, it means our seeking becomes so much more assisted, in a sense.
Yeah, makes sense. It was kind of in line with what I was thinking as well. With the teaching, living the teaching being kind of like important, and if it happens to be the destiny to meet a guru and spend time with them, it would happen. But I was just curious, I guess almost everyone of the enlightened individuals, if there is such a term, always had like a guru or somebody who they had spent time. So I was just curious how that happens.
I mean, in that regard, I would say that without a teacher, you're pretty much a teacher or a teaching. You're left to the unfolding of your thoughts unaided by anything else. It's just going to be a very slow trial and error process. So to the point where I'd say without exposure to teachers or teachings, I don't think someone would go very far. But that doesn't mean that they have to go and sit at the feet of a teacher for the rest of their life. The teachings can come in many different forms. Just listening to certain types of music, even modern pop music, that happens to be inspired by a seeker that has been aided by a teacher. You can listen to a song, and it can include a lot of wisdom in it. And that can inspire a contemplation. So the exposure to teaching doesn't have to be, in any very specific form.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Roger. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you for the questions. Hi, I'm Martin.
Hi, Roger.
Hi there.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. I've always got to thank you for doing this. It's so important what you do.
Pleasure.
Yeah, I'm still struggling because I do have long periods now of peace of mind, just dropping into I am. But what I'm doing is I was talking to my eldest son yesterday. He's the manager of a retail store. He always seems to be more. Ever since he was a little boy, he always seemed to be more wise than I was. Always, and I did hear myself saying to him, the problem at the moment, Rich, is I don't know what to do. And he said, Dad, no one knows what to do. We just do what's in front of us. You know, like you say, just go with the flow of life. And he said, I want to play golf this morning, and then I'm going to go and pick my his daughter up from school. Then he's going to cook them some dinner and then watch a film, and tomorrow's another day. And I just realized that yesterday when I was out walking, it was raining and I stopped under a bridge, and I think I was using my what you call the working mind to work out how I used to operate in the world in the past. If that makes any sense. There is this recurring thought is, and you covered it off earlier. What do I do in order to change my life circumstances? And I know it's about just dropping into I am and just saying it is what it is, and it's your destiny unfolding. But it just occurred to me, Roger, that yesterday is what we all seek in life is for people to be agreeable, to spend time with people who are agreeable. I was listening to a philosopher giving a lecture, and he played a tape of Barack Obama, basically saying that people think that they create big businesses and them, and what they don't realize is they've all had some help. And what Barack Obama was really pointing towards was that we're not doers. And then this philosopher, I forget his name now, was basically deriding Barack Obama, and people were sort of cheering him in the audience, and it was very, very interesting. So I don't know what I think the question I'm asking is this flip-flopping. It's just normal, isn't it? And I don't need really to worry, do I? That my destiny will just unfold. Just relax into it. Just, I don't know. I suppose I'm looking to you for reassurance.
Yeah, but the flip-flop is very normal. Even the relaxing into it is, you can only do that to the extent that destiny allows. But the realization that you can verbalize it already is a good indication that, you know, there's a potential to relax into it. Because if someone can't even verbalize that or see life like that, then the likelihood that there is a thought that's going to arise when there is suffering that says just what to do, you know, this is destiny, that thought isn't going to arise, and that thought can at least create a non-involvement with the flop, if the flop is happening. So I have confidence, Martin, that there'll be times in the next week where you really just say, it's all God's will unfolding. And that will create a non-involvement in the moment. That just lets it be, and some peace slides in those moments.
Yeah.
So good luck.
I get that. I get that, Roger. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Pleasure. Hi, John.
Hi, Roger. I hope you'll bear with me because this question is really a bit incorrect for me still. But I'm kind of wondering if you might agree that I sometimes have a sense that I could be seen as, from your perspective, as a bystander. And sometimes I feel as if the bystander watching whatever is happening feels as if it's inside my body, and sometimes it feels as if this awareness or bystander is something broader. But I'm also, the question I think that is forming is, does it really matter which it is? And if one is a bystander, do you really have a choice about whether you're standing by from inside or from outside? Does that make any sense?
Sure. If the bystander is uninvolved, it really doesn't make any difference, because it's uninvolved, which means no suffering. And so whether it is uninvolved from a sense of being inside the body or uninvolved from a sense of being outside the body, the only difference is a difference in how the state feels, with how the state is experienced. But as far as the experience of suffering, in both cases, if there's no involvement because there is bystanding or witnessing, then from the perspective of suffering, it's the same. The state, so the experiential state, can feel different because the bystander is in a different position in one. Now, often a lot of people assume from their experience that the lack of suffering happens when the bystander is on the outside, because for a lot of people, the witnessing tends to be a shift from heavy involvement where there is a sense of being in the body, and when you're in the body, the only option that most people know from their experience is to be involved. And then teachings come along, impact us in such a way that the bystander sort of appears on the outside, and there's a large degree of peace relative to the involvement. And so the assumption then gets set in and says, non-involvement happens when I don't know myself as the person, as in when I don't feel like I am inside the body. And that's a conclusion based on, in a way, a limited experience that person has. They have the experience of being in the body and being involved, or a shift where they are largely outside the body and not being involved. Whereas if, like you've described, you have the experience of all three, being in the body and being involved, being in the body and witnessing, and being out of the body and witnessing, you then have the added benefit of being able to assess three states instead of just two states. That maybe someone else can only assess two because that's the only two experiences they have. And if we start to see that there is no suffering available in both out of the body witnessing and in the body witnessing, and more so that it is possible to actually witness from a position of within the body, which a lot of people who haven't had that experience will assume, no, you can only witness from outside the body experience. So with this added information based on your experience, especially if we register that the seeking really is about the end of suffering and not about a certain state, as in experiential state of being outside the body, for example, then the seeking starts to become much more refined to the end of suffering, rather than thinking it's about experiential oneness where we feel like we're outside the body.
Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Hi, Jacob. Hi, Simon.
Hi, Roger. I thank you for the satsang today. Yeah, it's just a question that I've had hanging over for the past few days. Just wondered if you could clear it up. It's regarding what happens when the doer falls away and the psychological me falls away. It's what I've heard from others where this has happened is like, for instance, when the psychological me is there and we're looking at things like objects like a tree or something, that because we think we know it, because the psychological me thinks it knows what this is, it sees the tree and it's like, it's just ordinary. So it just sort of dismisses it as a tree, and that's it. You've seen it before. What I've heard from other people, but I haven't heard it from yourself, or maybe you have said it and I just haven't heard it, is that when the psychological me falls away, this is what I've heard from other people that this has happened to, and the doer falls away completely, that everything is like seen for like the first time, or it's all new, because you know it's no longer known. It's like a mystery. So I just wondered if you could say something about that.
They're not really completely synonymous with each other. So when that shift happens, it's not because the doer has fallen away per se. Doership falling away is something more specific than what happens in that shift. What happens in that shift is a knowing of life, not through a lens of relative thinking, not through a lens of relative labeling, which is not the same thing as the end of doership. The end of doership is not about, it's not the same thing as the end of labeling and seeing life through a filter of thought. So when we're encouraged to not think, when we're reminded that life can be known prior to our thinking of it, meaning you can just know the experience of seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, being, without commenting, when that's pointed out, we might find ourselves practicing really just happens. So I don't mean practicing disciplined way, but we might find ourselves just registering the experience, the trees, the sky, the birds, the sounds, in a way that we are aware of them within the field of awareness that is intrinsic to our nature. So we might find ourselves just stopping routinely through the day, and just being, which really means consciously being aware of the whole experience of life, all of the sounds, all of the sights, all of the thoughts, all of the emotions, all arising as a cacophony within the field of awareness that knows it. And that way of knowing life is very different to knowing life through thinking. And in the moments that it happens for the first time, and when it happens in contrast to a different way before it, so, you find yourself in the old way of thinking about life, and then it stops for a few minutes. In that contrast, there's a very significant qualitative difference. And the qualitative difference described as knowing life as it really is for the first time, or knowing life as it is compared to being lost in the illusion of life, let's say. Now, I use those descriptions loosely, not as some absolute, because when I say knowing life as it really is, I don't believe that to be an absolutely true statement, because I was going to say the truth, but it's not really the truth. Even when the relative thinking level or layer falls away, what is present is still a subjective experience. There's subjective on other layers compared to the thinking. So when the thinking falls away, that's one layer of subjectivity, a layer of subjectivity that has a very significant effect, falls away. And so the contrast, or the feeling, the qualitative feeling is, oh, now this is not relative. This is not subjective. So that's why when that shift happens, someone will describe it as seeing life as it is rather than seeing life through a relative filter. Because it feels like that. And it feels like that because a filter has fallen away. And so it's relatively less relative. It's become less relative. And so, but it hasn't become absolute. But comparing it to the more relative version that was there before, you could say one is absolute and the other is relative. But at some point we'll come to the conclusion, oh, what I'm calling absolute isn't really absolute. I don't know if that makes any sense to you.
Yeah. Well, I didn't get an answer to the question. I didn't feel that there was an answer to the question, but
no, you're right. You're right. So that's describing what people will describe as knowing life truly, or knowing what is, or feeling like life is known directly. That just described as that process. Now, the end of the belief in personal doership is different to that. The end of the belief in personal doership is the end of an arising of certain thoughts and certain feelings of uncomfortableness. Now, because the uncomfortableness is a form of thinking, when someone experiences the falling away of the relative layer of thinking, obviously the suffering has to fall away with it, because the suffering is contained on that layer. However, when the belief in personal doership falls away, other forms of thinking can continue. And the other forms of thinking that continue mean you're not in that same state that someone else that is being described when the thinking falls away. So the end of the belief in personal doership doesn't mean the end of the belief that you're a human being or a person. It just means the end of the belief that I am a human being that is the doer of what is unfolding. And so they're two somewhat interrelated, but not synonymous with each other understandings.
Right, but what about what I was saying about seeing things like for the first time? Well, for instance, I mean, I had an awakening experience where, but it was just an experience. So what happened was that I was like in a woodland, and suddenly it was like a one experience. Everything fell away, and everything just seemed new. It just seemed like I was seeing everything for the first time. Like I'd been wearing like a motorcycle helmet all my life with the visor down, and suddenly it'd been removed, and everything seemed the same, but new, different. Like I hadn't seen it before.
Mm-hmm.
That was just an experience. But I've heard people who, well, so-called liberated people, say that's what happens when liberation happens. That's just one of the things that you notice, is that everything is like seen for the first time.
Yeah, but you know why you're saying it's just an experience is because it happened and then it stopped and reverted back to something else, right?
Just an experience, but I'm just saying that once the psychological meat falls away completely, is that something that that occurs?
No. I don't think they're still with each other. So the psychological me doesn't, at the end of the psychological me doesn't, you see, because it's a bit tricky, because a lot of teachings will focus on different things. Certain methodologies rely on that shift happening for suffering to fall away. And it's not to say that shift is the end of suffering, but that shift can be significant at the end of significant for the end of suffering setting in. And if a teaching is relying on that shift to happen, then really they need to describe everything in relation to that shift, which then means we hear the teaching and think it's all about that shift, and that shift is liberation. Now, I can be quite emphatic about the fact that shift can happen and suffering can still carry on arising. That shift doesn't mean the end of suffering, because that shift doesn't undo the belief in personal doership. It doesn't undo attachment to outcomes. It means it's not present when that is happening. But the flip-flopping will tend to carry on. Now, if someone says, oh, I have no more flip-flopping and no more suffering, and I'm always in this state of knowing things through this helmet with no visor, it's because this, in my view, it's because that is being valued, that way of being positioned in life, as in seeing life from a perspective of, let's say, there's nobody home, there's nobody here, is being valued and considered as being what liberation is. And so if the case, then that position is maintained. And I'm speaking from experience, because it was only when it dawned on me that really enlightenment is not about maintaining that witnessing position, but rather about the end of suffering. And that once I realized and felt that the end of suffering can exist in a much more embodied perspective of life, then there was a relaxation on my part that kept that witnessing in place. And when that relaxation happened, what is described in that shift tends to fade away. If I say that, someone who really believes that it's about the shift will say, oh, that's terrible news. The thing that happened in the shift fades away or has faded away for you. That's very unfortunate. And I say, no, it isn't. As far as I'm concerned, it's not unfortunate, because it allows life to be lived from a relative standpoint again, from the standpoint of being a human being that knows themselves as a human being. So a whole layer of things allowed to come back in, but not the thinking of doership and attachment to outcome, because that has this. That's what the distinction I'm trying to make is that when the shift happens, there's a certain quality and qualitative nature to the experience that if you're describing the shift, you will describe it's like seeing life for the first time, because what's happening is you're seeing a tree free of your label of the tree, free of your thinking filter. And so you know the tree in a way that you've never known the tree before. And it seems very significant, and it is part of seeing past our thinking. It's part of seeing that thinking is an additional layer in the experience of life. And that's very important for the doership and attachment to fall away, because they are a layer, but it's not all thinking that to fall away. So I wouldn't phrase liberation as being synonymous with knowing life free of thought. I'd say liberation is the end of the doership thoughts and the attachment thoughts, which really mean no more guilt, no more blame, no more worry, no more expectation, no more believing that, my happiness is to be found in outcomes. And therefore that means feeling content and at peace with life as it unfolds, because life will unfold, pleasure at sometimes, pain at other times. And we find that what it means for those not to be there anymore means that the uncomfortableness with the pleasure and pain of life doesn't arise. And that's very different to the state of oneness that is what is that is being described when this filter of thought falls down.
Okay, thanks, Roger. Thanks. I think I know what you're saying. So it's basically a shift that sometimes too much importance can be put on, and it's not really what the objective is. And yeah, so somebody can latch on to that and think that's what it's all about, and it's just a part of it, and it's not the objective.
That's well put, and because it's so well put, let me then come in to just round it off, sort of by putting, and at the same time, it's very important because when that shift happens, it loosens up a whole lot of things that are important in what I would say the more important end is, which is the end of a very specific type of thinking. So reaffirming what you said is sometimes we can think it's all about that, and that is an imbalance. And at the same time, we don't want to say, oh, it's not at all about that. So it's about some happy medium that appreciates the importance of seeing your own thinking and the importance of not assuming it's all about the end of all thinking.
Yeah, that's why this is such a practical teaching. Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks a lot for that.
Very good. Thank you. I think we'll take one more question. Hi.
Oh, hello. Hello. Hello.
Hello, Peter.
Oh, hi. Sorry about that. Technical glitches. Yes. So my question is, you kind of answered it actually. Well, in part, the previous question. I've been thinking about how to reconcile these two approaches. The teaching, because I, on one hand, the bottom-up notions that are predominant in this teaching of non-doership, attachment to outcomes, and then the sort of top-down ideas of, oneness. And I guess I've found myself sort of trying to more and more drop into this place of what we call their abide in the I am, I guess, for lack of and just trying to meditate a little more. And I was wondering about that connection between, you describe your journey as one that started from a sort of top-down thing, and then you came to Ramesh, and he helped sort of integrate everything for you with a more down-to-earth kind of practical. And I'm sort of coming at it from somebody who hasn't really had any awakenings or identifiable, perhaps maybe mini awakenings here and there, but nothing dramatic. Mm-hmm. So I guess I find myself not craving, that's too strong of a word, but wondering if, because I guess if I had if the notion of non-doership had become fully assimilated and internalized, I may not have this thought. And I'm just wondering, do the two sort of approaches, can they happen simultaneously? I mean, because mm-hmm. I don't think I've developed an internalized notion of non-doership. I think it's still sort of in the realm of belief, even though it does have sort of tangible effects, and it does sort of calm me down, the thought of it. But I don't know if I fully believe it. I'm not even sure, to be honest. Sorry for the rambling as usual, but I guess that shows my sort of uncertainty around this whole question. So my question is, can the two happen simultaneously? And what is, how do they complement each other?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's not really that they're not really two. They are, so even within so with what I put forward, there's a lot of emphasis on dropping into the dimension outside of the stream of thinking and just resting in being, because that's where we get to have some respite. That's where it's sort of like getting onto the wagon, so to speak, is resting in being is a place where the habitual thinking of doership and attachment get cut off. And that sort of strengthens the capacity to be in life without habitually thinking. So the more and more often we visit a place of just resting, let's say with your eyes closed, is just the easier way to start off, and stopping sort of, and that only happens because maybe there's a glimpse that, you know, my normal way of thinking that I have to go, I have to get somewhere, I have to apply myself, otherwise I'm falling behind. If it clicks, that's maybe the problem. Then there's more reason for us to just stop and actually stop the trying to get somewhere and be quiet and have our system somehow appreciate that, instead of, you know, if we're structured a different way, as soon as we stop, we're encouraging ourselves to go, which people feel guilty sitting on the couch watching television, because something inside says you're wasting your time, you're not being productive. And maybe it's a great way of utilizing a certain time of life to just relax and enjoy. And yet a part of us is saying, no, ridiculous. That can't be what life's about, or beneficial. So the more that we can find a capacity to just stop and think, look at this, this available all the time. I can stop at any time. Really, when you're driving the car, you can still be driving the car and stop your thinking about where you're going, you know, what you need to do. And it's always available. Silence always available, especially once our system has learnt where it is. When we don't know where to find silence, meaning when we haven't realized that silence is when the body says, hey, I don't need to talk, I don't need to think in this moment, I can just rest. You know, when our system hasn't figured that out, it's available. In theory, we could just rest, but the body hasn't figured that out. So it's always going in the other direction. Once we realize rest means just stop thinking that I need to think, then it's a whole door opened up. And the non-doership and the non-attachment is really just the atrophying of the habit of doership and attachment. So resting in being is what atrophies it, plus the conceptual understanding of the what non-doership is, what doership is, what attachment is. The combination of just resting and stopping, plus the combination of having descriptions that can allow us to see, oh, look, that's me attached to an outcome. That's me convinced that my happiness was in, I don't know, my friend coming on holiday with me, and now they've canceled and I'm freaking out. and I'm blaming them and all that. And we might catch ourselves saying, that's me convinced that my happiness, my happiness, is to be found in my friend having maintained the commitment to come on holiday with me. And if we didn't have a concept of attachment to outcome, we're never going to see it for what it is. We would just get involved in the fact that a friend has cancelled, which is an outcome that is painful, and think that that was an attack on who I am. So it does need a combination of the practical concepts and times when we just drop out of anything to do with practical daily living and just rest in a dimension, a deeper dimension of the human being.
Okay, yeah.
And yeah, so the deep knowing of non-doership isn't referring to an intellectual understanding of non-doership. It's really referring to a state of just turning up in life and finding that suffering in the old way doesn't happen. And the conclusion, when it doesn't happen, if someone says, how come suffering doesn't happen? And the deduction is, well, the understanding of non-doership and non-attachment must be total, which demonstrates it's not about knowing eyes and then concluding that if the suffering isn't arising, it means there's no more misunderstanding. And the absence of misunderstanding is referred to as understanding.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, and I guess one other, just a follow up on the sense of, so I guess I was concerned, I'm not so concerned, but the thought comes up that I need to sort of see this non-doership in action, so to speak, like so to sort of be convinced that even though the belief in the non-doership helps, it has lessened the suffering, as you say, it's perhaps maybe it is coming into, but and is being present, is being in that state of being. I've noticed when I'm in there. Sorry, I'm getting an echo of my own voice. Formulate a sentence, but when I've noticed that, for example, I do yoga, and when I'm present with what's happening, I'll notice, each movement, and I started saying, well, did I bring about this movement? Was this my willpower that made me decide to, I don't know, do a certain movement or emotion? And I've noticed the more present I am, it's almost like the body is sort of directing the motion. So is there a link between presence and sort of recognizing non-doership in action? Is there a link there?
Yes, because the deep seeing of non-doership is to realize, wow, what happens, life is happening even when I'm not trying to make it happen.
Right.
And then in that we realize, this belief that I am making life happen is superfluous and is additional. And so that's where it becomes clear, there's a belief that I am the doer, whereas when I look at it, I see that there is a body that is forced to wake up in the morning. We don't really choose to wake up. We find ourselves awake. Mm-hmm. And then the body at some point gets out of bed and eats and functions according to its design. You can't suddenly start putting your pants over your head, right? you just wouldn't do it. You're not conditioned to do that. So you see that the body steps into its jeans and buttons up its shirt, and we're convinced, oh, I, as a doer, as this identity is doing all of this. But with presence and the concepts that say, look, that body has been conditioned by life to understand that jeans are worn over your legs and shirts are put over your shoulders and buttoned up and what have you. And because that's been the conditioning of life, that's how I function. And it doesn't require a doer to make that happen, because the conditioning is what makes it happen. So this notion of conditioning being something that impacts the entity that is a physical entity that has grown, and I didn't do the growing. The body just grew according to the blueprint. So seeing that the body grows, and at the same time as the body growing, it is impacted by new conditioning. That allows a supplementing of our assumption that, the genes get put on because I do it. If we don't have a concept that says what the body is, or what the person is a body and its conditioning, and that the body and its conditioning are forced to function according to its genetic makeup and its conditioning. If we don't have that concept, we assume that there must be a me doer making it happen. Now we have another explanation that can dissolve the belief in a doer and allow us to see that life happens because of factors that are not in our control. And so, that becomes part of our deep recognition of non-doership. So it's definitely not just meant to be a belief. Oh, I believe I'm not a doer. We need to be able to explain why convincingly to someone. Like, why are you, someone might say, what do you mean you're not a doer? And you say, and then you go and you explain it. It's not, I'm not saying to explain it to someone else, but to be able to explain it to someone else means you understand for yourself the very principle of the topic. Whereas a belief, if someone believes it, just believes it, then someone says, can you explain it? And you go, oh, explain it? I don't know how to explain it, but Roger told me that's the way it is, and I believe him. So I'd say, no, that's no good. Don't believe me. You need to see it for yourself, so that you can stand by it independent of Roger. You could throw Roger away, right, at some point. And without Roger, I still understand that life is a happening, not my doing.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure I'm at that stage yet, although because I actually have tried to explain it to some people. It didn't go over too well. But also, I wonder, what was my point? I guess the most difficult, the grappling with that notion is with thoughts, because I guess, as I've heard you said, I mean, we don't control our thoughts, and that makes perfect sense. But it feels like in order to actually see that and not just believe it, one has to really witness one's thoughts as they're happening, which is by definition almost impossible, because if you're thinking, then you're by definition not witnessing. Anyway, I'm getting into the weeds a little bit here, but
it's a good point, because it is a good point, because until we see that thoughts are not our doing, because that's really where that's the glue is, believing that thoughts are my doing? Because if we think the thoughts are
Yeah.
my doing, then everything afterwards must be doing, because it's a result of the thought.
Yeah.
And so often when we look at non-doing, the non-doership of life, someone looks at everything after the thoughts,
Yeah.
but the thought is quarantined as sacred. That's mine.
Right.
So we do need to come and we need to see the thought is not mine. And so an example is language, right? Because language is a form of thinking. It's thinking in verbal form. And we speak in English. I speak in English because I was conditioned by life to speak in English. I couldn't possibly speak in English if I wasn't conditioned by life to speak in English. If I was conditioned to speak French, I'd have to speak French. Now, we say, well, I speak English because I am speaking English. I, the doer, choose to speak English. I have no choice but to speak English because life conditioned me to speak English. And so in the same way, if you see, I don't know, someone, pick some discrimination that people tend to have, you see someone of that description, and the thought arises, oh, that's so-and-so, some derogatory thought about the person. When you look at it, that thought arises because of the household, let's say, that you grew up in, and the ideas, the beliefs of the parents, or a society that you grew up in, a group of friends you hung out with, a television program you watched repeatedly, whatever it is, something has made you think about a certain minority group, for example, or whatever. When we forget that there must be some conditioning, when we forget about that, all we're left with is a thought that arises. It arises inside me, and we go, well, that's mine. Because we have no other factors that we consciously see as being what determines that thought. So we don't see any factors that are impersonal, like external conditioning, that determine a thought. Then we default to me.
Yeah.
And that's the psychological me. That's the psychological doer. And it's an error because there are impersonal, external factors that determine everything, including our thinking. And we just don't have those explanations front and center in our attitude to life.
Yeah, well, that I guess that's the crux of the matter I'm trying to see. I guess it's matter I'm trying to see. I guess it's hard for me sometimes to separate. It seems like there are categories of things that I can easily see as conditioning and not my doing, and then other categories which are harder. You know, you mentioned, I'm sorry to keep you. Probably, I know it's been going long here, but you mentioned how Ramesh would say, you know, at the end of your day, you know, sit down with a sherry or whatever, a beer, and try and find a moment in your day that you would consider your doing, and look at that. And I've sort of tried to do that, and there are, you know, I guess the ones that pop out would be more like, you know, you have a decision, you know, often it's, you know, I would describe it as willpower, for lack of a better word. And I know this teaching would immediately refute anything known as willpower. The notion itself doesn't hold up in this teaching, but that's what I understand it as. So it's like, should I go and work out, or do, you know, something that I feel will be beneficial to me? And, you know, I can easily, I could easily go one way or the other. And that category of actions is really hard to see as you know, I'm anticipating your answer, which is, you know, you didn't have that thought that I should go work out. You know, that was a conditioned thought. So, but I guess I have a feeling,
or even the feeling of willpower, that is, I am going to work out. I don't want to, but I'm going to do it because I know that it's good for me or whatever. You could say, well, I went and worked out because I said it was good for me. I didn't want to do it on a physical level, let's say, but I decided that I'm going to do it. And, you know, all of that decision of I'm going to do it because it's good for me, my description is that comes from genes and up-to-date conditioning. And yet, if we don't see that, then we block off the impersonal determining factor of that thinking. And what do we stick in when we have no other explanation? Personal doership. So
exactly.
The personal investigation of your own that Ramesh suggests, where pick that one event during the day that you are convinced is your doing, and then investigate it. It always collapses if you have the rules, let's say, and the rules are that, you know, during the day you see something, you hear something, you smell something, you touch something, meaning a circumstance. You are in a circumstance, and there's an input or a thought, and then a thought arises, and then an action arises. And the rules and the explanation says, you know, you saw something and you weren't in control of what you saw because you weren't in control of whether the bird flew past or not. You weren't in control of whether you heard the dog bark or not. And then you weren't in control of thought arises when you see the bird, because the thought is based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning and the stimuli that has come into your system and inspired the thought. So if we look at it, if we have those rules front and center, there simply isn't anything you can investigate without finding that it was caused by a very impersonal movement based on factors that you weren't in control of. But if some of those rules fall away, then the investigation can fall foul because we've forgotten some of the rules. And we might say, hey, but that's my doing.
Yeah.
And once we bring the rules back in, we'll find not your doing.
Yeah. And the only rules are basically your conditioning and up-to-date conditioning and your genes.
And the circumstance you find yourself in.
Right.
And you're not in control of the circumstance, and you weren't in control of your genes and up-to-date conditioning, and there's no other factors. So that means, well, I can't be in control of the outcomes, including the outcome of the thought that arises after seeing something, or the outcome of the action that happens to the thought.
Right. Yeah, it's just a string of endless chain reaction, basically.
Exactly, of impersonal factors. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you, everybody.